John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress. Born to the poorest of poor families in Bedford, England in 1628, John's family estate had shrunk over the generations, and his father, who was a tinker, barely was able to make ends meet. John Bunyan was a cusser, a rebel, an awful son who ran away to cause trouble with his friends rather than help around the house. He stole from richer neighbors for fun, pretending he was Robin Hood. Once he found a small boat and used it to pull up a stream to a farm. There he sneaked into the cellar and stole some cheese. When he returned to the boat and his friends, he filled the boat with stolen food. As he boarded it, the boat capsized. John, not knowing how to swim, felt himself sinking. He cried out to God and promised to be good. John knew there was a God because he went to the Church of England every Sunday as commanded by the law. Somehow he was able to find his footing, but after he coughed and sputtered and recovered, he forgot his promise to God. At home, John neglected to help his mother and younger sister with household chores. When a younger brother, William, was added to the family, John treated him much the same. He did have some remorse when his mother became ill, but it wasn't enough to make him change, and it turned to regret when his mother and then his sister died. When John's father remarried, John was filled with anger and bitterness toward his new stepmom. Consequently, the year he turned 16, he left home, barely saying goodbye to his younger brother, and he joined the army fighting for Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was attempting to overthrow King Charles. As you can imagine, John met all types of people in the army and even learned some new cuss words, which was amazing because he knew just about everyone. He listened to talk on all subjects, and for the first time heard people say there was no God. He trained as a musketeer and was in combat, but he got assigned to rebuild the castle wall. So he did fire his musket, but he was never sure if he killed anyone or not. Cromwell, known as Old Ironside, slowly won the war against King Charles. Finally, the war was over. John was hoping to go home, but he got assigned to Ireland and then actually ended up going to Wales because Oliver Cromwell wanted to fight and conquer more territory. In Wales, he was assigned to help destroy a castle. This made John pretty sad because it took hundreds of years for them to build these beautiful castles, and here they were getting destroyed in the war. War made John feel like life and death were up to luck and chance. Once a fellow soldier begged John to go in his place on an assignment, and that person was killed that day, and John realized it would have been him being killed, and he just felt like life had a lot of luck and chance involved, and he began to leave God out. While help guarding this castle, John was assigned to board a boat at night and slide back and forth across the river to make sure no enemies passed through on the river during the night. One night, the enemy cut one end of the rope, and John's small boat capsized into the water. Again, he cried out to God, and he still didn't know how to swim, by the way. He made promises to stop cussing and reform his behavior. When he woke up, the water was being pumped out of him, and everyone was amazed that he had held onto the rope even though he lost consciousness, while somebody just happened to walk by and see what happened and pull on the rope and dragged him out of the water. Again, John did not honor God and make the changes he had promised. Once John saw some soldiers picking on a shepherd. As he went closer to see what was going on, he saw the shepherd was actually a woman and in need of help. So he told the other soldiers to get lost, and he comforted the woman. Her name was Mary. She was grateful for his help. When they got to talking, he found out that she lived with her aunt and uncle, and she was afraid that her tyrannical uncle was going to take advantage of her because her aunt was really sick, and she thought her aunt would die soon and her uncle would force her to marry him. When the war ended, John went home to live with his brother Willie, his dad and stepmom. He began to enjoy the tinker trade that he learned from his father. They would work with metal and fix different things that were broken. After working and saving some money, he walked to where Mary, the shepherdess, lived and asked her to marry him. She wanted some time to pray about it, and then she agreed. She left her home and married him. John rented his own home in Bedford and supported Mary by tinkering. Mary had brought with her 2 religious books, which she got from her father, and John read those to her. He did know how to read and write, although he barely went to school at all. They attended the Church of England together on Sundays, and one Sunday there was a sermon about how it was wrong to play games and bet on Sundays. Since this was something John did regularly, his ears perked up, and when he continued these activities, he heard a voice say to him, "Will you leave your sins and go to heaven, or have your sins and go to hell?" From that time on, his sins began to weigh on him. When a woman from the village who was known to have a foul mouth reproved John for his cussing, his eyes were finally opened to see how bad his words were, especially in the eyes of this woman who was known to have a foul mouth. One day, as he was visiting another village looking for tinkering work, John met some women who were talking about spiritual things. Since he was good with words and could argue two sides of most arguments, he looked for a chance to join the conversation. But to his surprise, these women spoke with more authority than his pastor. John went back often to listen to these women, and soon he began attending their small church of 12 people. John ended up joining this church and being baptized. He also moved so he could be closer to that church. He still struggled with a lot of doubts and torment. When sad things happened in his family or things didn't go as he thought, he still had a lot of inner struggle with doubts. And then finally he did realize he had been counting on his own merits instead of trusting in what Jesus had done for him. And he was able to rise above his doubts by faith in what God did through him. As John traveled and shared with others what God had done in his life, he became quite good at debating and showing the way to God through Jesus. He often encountered Quakers who were mystics and did not follow the Bible. John debated with them and tried to persuade them that they should follow the instructions in the Bible. Later, he wrote a tract warning against their erroneous beliefs. John's next tract was against the nobility. They wanted him to be quiet. They did not want the poor people to have the freedoms they enjoyed for a time while Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector. People flocked to hear this poor tinker preach. They were surprised that a poor person could be so knowledgeable. Unfortunately, John's wife Mary died slowly. He loved her deeply, and when comforting his children after her death, he described heaven for them in great detail, which helped to ease their pain. Later, John married a young lady named Elizabeth, who was also a committed Christian and loved his children. After Oliver Cromwell died, his son ruled for a short time, but then he wasn't very good, and he was chased out, and Prince Charles II was made king. King Charles II made many changes, appointed new judges, made new laws, executed people who had supported Cromwell. Then he made a law requiring all pastors to preach the Church of England liturgy and nothing else. The free church that John attended now numbered 200, and they were forced to meet in secret. John continued to preach and share his faith as before, although he knew he was risking being arrested. But he felt that if he would stop preaching, how could he ask his congregation to continue to have faith during hard times? He wanted to be an example for them, so he kept on boldly preaching. Sure enough, while preaching in a meeting, John was arrested. He was taken to the Bedford jail, which was a place he knew well. He had preached there to the inmates many times. After some months in jail, John was put on trial. He defended his actions from the scriptures, which he knew better than those who opposed him. They actually had to get out their Bibles and see if what he was quoting from the Bible was actually in there. So he kind of embarrassed them. If John would have agreed to stop preaching, they would have let him go free, but this he would not do. So they sent him back to jail for 3 months and told him he would have a retrial, and if he didn't stop preaching, at that point he would be sent to America. While John was in jail, his wife miscarried. He was very concerned about her and the children, who hardly had enough to live on, and he didn't have a lot of income, obviously, while he was locked up in jail. But John used his time as best he could, sharing his faith with other prisoners and writing spiritual poems. The jailer, who was known to be kind, allowed John to visit home some nights. When time came for his retrial, it was denied. Even though Elizabeth actually went and pleaded for him, they denied it. So John's first year in prison passed. He now had 4 children, and in order to earn a little money, he made shoelaces while in jail. Besides this activity, John taught himself to play the flute using a flute he made from a chair leg in jail. He also began to write his autobiography, Grace Abounding. After 4 years in prison, a plague broke out in London. Ever since the Black Plague, people were very understandably paranoid about plague. Still, this one spread all across England. The jailer allowed the prisoners to go home because if the plague broke out in the jail, they would all probably die because they were in such close quarters. After a few months, the plague passed and the prisoners went back to jail. Then John got word that he was paroled. So now he could go home and be more free to preach. The free church he was part of had dwindled to 50 members, but whenever John Bunyan preached, people flocked to hear him. The only downside was that in a small town, it was impossible to hide, and John was soon back in the Bedford jail. This time John was allowed to have visitors, and he could often be found encouraging his fellow believers. He revised his autobiography and sometimes was allowed to go out and visit his family and other church members as well. Then he decided to write another book. He had read an allegory of the Christian life, and he wanted to write a book that would be similar to that would be both entertaining and instructive, an allegory of the Christian life. As he wrote it bit by bit, it got longer and longer, and he would have fellow prisoners read it and give feedback. He wanted to make sure they could understand it and learn from it. John drew on his own life experiences and people he knew for characters in the book.
Oh, is that
Altogether, John Bunyan spent 10 years in jail before the Declaration of Indulgence of Religious Freedom was passed in 1671. At this time, he finally had the freedom to go home and continue preaching. John became the organizer of a network of churches that continued to grow. His allegory, Pilgrim's Progress, was laid aside unfinished while John focused his energy on preaching. His church was able to buy a meeting barn and a horse for him to use. He traveled and preached, and his family grew to 6 children. Again, the law changed, and John was summoned to court for not attending the Church of England service. He didn't go to the summons, but eventually he was arrested. This time he was put in a different jail where he could have no visitors. He worked another 6 months until Pilgrim's Progress was finished, and soon after that he was set free again. When John got up the courage to have a friend read Pilgrim's Progress and consider it for publishing, he got a surprise. His friend read it all in one night and told John he would never be jailed again. This friend rightly predicted the book would make John so famous and popular they would not be able to put him in prison again. Indeed, it made him famous almost immediately. No one had published an allegory such as this before. Don Quixote was published around the same time, and the two works were compared, and both were very popular. In his lifetime, John published many books on the Christian faith. He went on to write a sequel to Pilgrim's Progress, which was about Pilgrim's wife, Christiana. He traveled many miles and preached wherever he could, persuading and encouraging believers. Then John passed away when he was on a preaching trip. He got very wet and cold and got very sick, so unfortunately he was away from home when he died. Some of the main things I've been thinking about after studying John Bunyan were that he was bold in preaching against the Quakers and the nobility. He was bold to the point of being arrested. He didn't care what people did to him. He felt like the truth needed to be heard. He used his time well while in jail. Instead of being discouraged, he wrote about the kingdom, and this was a time where it was expensive to publish books, so you had to really work on them, and it's just amazing all the number of books that he wrote besides all the other things he did. It amazes me that Pilgrim's Progress, which has been enjoyed and appreciated by millions of people and is still popular today, was written because of hardship when John was in prison. If John had gotten what he wanted, he would have been able to be with his family and preach and build a church. But since he was in jail, went through that hardship, he wrote the book, and now we have both his autobiography and this book. And I want to just give a shout out here to John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress, a book by Sam Wellman.